Good evening. The theme this year for our Lenten talks is Welcome to the Table, which refers to the many stories in the Gospels where Jesus welcomes a wide assortment of people to his meal table. The table can be thought of as a metaphor for how God welcomes everyone and feeds us, often in unexpected ways and as a wonderful gift. We should understand that the thought of welcoming everyone had become a radical message at the time of Jesus' ministry. The Jewish leadership had morphed their tradition into anything but one of inclusiveness. In fact, it had hardened into a ritualistic vehicle by which they actually excluded others. They had become immersed in the approach that salvation was for them alone. And of course, Jesus' teachings turned that on its head. We see example after example of how Jesus embraced people who were thought of as unclean in one way or another. I'd like to talk about the story of Zacchaeus, probably because when I was a child, we always sang a song in Sunday school about Zacchaeus. I see heads nodding. Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. And that stuck with me so much so that when I see a box of Lucky Charms, the little guy on the front is a Middle Eastern leprechaun named Zacchaeus. All right? So the problem for Zacchaeus was that he was a tax collector. And we have to remember that Israel was under Roman occupation at the time. And so when he was collecting taxes, he was doing it on behalf of the occupying country. So not good if you're a Jew to see that. And what is interesting to note is that they were allowed, these tax collectors, to pay themselves by putting a surcharge on every tax that they collected, sometimes of up to 100%. So this is not a guy you want to have a meal with if you're a good Jewish type. Well, one day Jesus is walking through and Zacchaeus wants to see him, and so he climbs the nearest tree since he's a wee little man. And it happens to be a sycamore tree. And it's my understanding that sycamore trees were also ritually unclean. So you have a tax collector who has climbed a sycamore tree. It's kind of a double whammy here. And Jesus notices this and looks up and says, Zacchaeus, you need to come down because I'm going to come to your house and eat a meal. There's another problem. Everyone and everything in Zacchaeus' house would be ritually unclean just due to Zacchaeus' status. And it probably wasn't kosher food either. And yet Jesus reached out to him. It would be easy to look at Jesus' example and, frankly, most of the examples, I think, in the Bible and conclude that if we want to be inclusive or seek people out to include, we need only look so far as those who are the most downtrodden or the most socially unacceptable. And I don't think that's wrong, but I feel like if we want to get at the heart of what Jesus wants us to realize, we need to broaden that definition a bit. What else is there that can make us feel separate from God's community? What else is there that divides us? It could be anything, really. It could be problems at work, issues with a family member, financial problems, mental illness, or even politics. You might be a liberal in Southwest Washington. It doesn't matter. What matters is if there's something going on in your life that makes you feel like you're on the outside looking in, you need inclusion. When in fact we may not even realize that we need inclusion at the time. Here's an example from the Bible. This is a story I'd like to read. And in fact, Rick had talked about it this last Sunday, and I think even before that. It's a story of how Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. And like any good sidewalk preacher, I'm going to carve out just the verses that make my point. Before I start, this section, it's in John, it's chapter 11. Jesus has been told that Lazarus is very ill, and in fact already knows that he's going to die. And Jesus takes his time getting to be with Lazarus. Now, Lazarus was a dear friend, and his sisters, Mary and Martha, were friends as well with Jesus. So Jesus is intentionally delaying in order to create a teachable moment by the time he arrives to be with Lazarus. Martha has just run into Jesus outside of their city. I think it was Bethany. And that's where we pick up. Martha went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, so there was a group, saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" And they said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. And it goes on. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." Moving forward a little here, Jesus, again, greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was laid against it. And we know how the story ends. He raises Lazarus. And I like this story because for a couple of reasons. One is that it reminds me of Jesus' humanity. I find myself morphing into the thought that Jesus was a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant guy. You can see where this is going, with brown hair and blue eyes, who looked just like me without glasses, running around spewing truths. And that's really not what he was. Although he was very human, the Son of God had all of the emotions that we did. He had friends, he laughed, he probably told jokes, he ate, he drank, everything. He had the entire human experience, and this passage makes it more real for me. In this case, though, he wept. Why? He knew all along this was going to end well, and ultimately this was going to have or make everyone immensely happy. So why? Why was he crying? Did he feel guilty? I don't think so. There was no need for it. He was creating a teachable moment. I submit to you that Jesus cried because he had been away when his friend died, and he had been excluded from their grief. So the message here to me is, if the Son of God can feel excluded, how much more so can we, for reasons that we don't even know about? Pastor Jake asked me to share a story from my own experience, and so I'll do that now. About 5 years ago, a dear friend of mine named Slim, who was 6'7" and 160 pounds, that's the name, had been ill. He was like a grandfather figure to me. My own grandfather lived far away in Oklahoma, and I only saw him about once every 4 years. So Slim was a very special person to me. I knew him during the first job I had outside of college. So anyway, a friend of mine, or I should back up a little bit, he had prostate cancer a few years before this, and although he recovered from it, he never really quite felt well. He was, at this time, 89 years old, and as you know, when you're 89, it doesn't take a lot to put your health on a bad trajectory. So, unbeknownst to me, about 2 weeks before this, he'd been moved into a nursing home to try to get better. So, a friend called me, said, "Slim's in the nursing home, maybe you want to come see him." And as it worked out, my family and I were traveling north to Seattle that weekend, and so we stopped in Olympia, where he was, on the way. And when we got in there, he clearly wasn't well, but he was able to communicate. He had hearing aids. They were out, so we had to shout back and forth. You can just picture this. But there were nurses around, people around. They were trying to feed him. And then by the time we actually got to sit down and talk, it was time to go. I had all of about 15 minutes with my friend. So on we went, but I was glad. At least I got to see him. Well, 2 days later, I was at home, and with nothing to do, I suddenly felt like, I didn't get a very good visit with Slim. I really need to go back up there and see him. And I didn't really want to do it. It's a 4-hour round trip, but yet I just felt moved to go up there. So I did. And when I got there, he was alone, but he had deteriorated an amazing amount in just the 2 days since I had been there with